Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Legal Cheek podcast. My name is Julia Szaniszlo and I am a writer and editor at Legal Cheek. And as always, I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Ryan Scott.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, hello. So today we thought we'd bring you another advice podcast, and we're talking about all things a law degree, whether that's the PGDL or the LLB. We're going to take you through a little bit of advice on how to actually prepare for these degrees if they're coming up for you in September, about how to stand out in your applications if you're applying for the bachelor's, and how to prepare for the conversion course, or as I like to think of it, the daunting 9 months that I have to expect for the next year. But Ryan, you of course did a law degree yourself, so how did you go about preparing to apply, and what kind of tips and tricks can you give to everyone?
Yeah, I did indeed. So the very first step of like your law degree application is obviously your personal statement. And I want to talk about quite a lot of things you can do to boost that or stand out, especially when you're applying to the top universities. Your personal statement kind of means a lot. It's your first impression to the university admissions team. I was going to call them graduate recruiters then. I'm so used to the training contract language. I'm trying to think what university is. So first of all, you can talk about things to read before you get to university. So you don't need to read law textbooks at 16, 17, 18 whenever you're applying to uni. You're not expected to really know the law inside and out or anything like that. You just expect to show some sort of curiosity about it. There's a couple of introductory legal books that I'd recommend, and it's kind of like the most popular ones people always talk about. One of them is The Rule of Law by Tom Bingham. It explains what the rule of law actually means and discusses concepts like equality of the law, access to justice, limits on government power, and it gives you a lot of really interesting real world examples of these like in like real life applications. So human rights cases, counter-terrorism cases, and it discusses them really well. It gives you a lot to talk about in an interview. And it also gives you something to kind of like anchor your application around if you are interested in that sort of thing. Another book which I am more personally biased towards is called What About Law? And it was written by three Cambridge lecturers, two of which were my supervisors, and they are fantastic, fantastic women. They know how to explain concepts in such uncomprehensible and just like accessible manner for people. Even at university, they do really fantastic lecturers and they're very renowned in their field. So What About Law was written by Catherine Barnard, Jenna Ursuline, and Graham Verga. And it just discusses how legal reasoning works, and it gives a brief introduction to all the core subjects in the law degree. So criminal, public, tort law, trust law, contract law, things like that. It basically tells you what to expect when you're studying these things and acts as a primer as to how law is studied at degree level, I guess. Reading a book kind of gives you an in your application, and it gives you something interesting to talk about in your personal statement. And if you get through the kind of personal statement round at some universities, you'll then go to interview. I think that's the case at Oxbridge for law, and Durham perhaps. So it gives you just something to talk about a little bit more there. You can flesh out your application. Another thing is newspapers. I wouldn't say that you need to be, you hear commercial awareness a lot. Commercial awareness is super, super important for training contract applications when you're a bit older. I don't think you need to be super commercially aware for your university interviews, especially because commercial awareness is all about understanding the business world. When you're doing a law degree, you see at least the seven core subjects of a law degree plus some optional modules. And only one of them is contract law. And you can perhaps choose to do company law. You've also got things like family law, criminal law, trust law, things like that, land law. Not all of that is to do with kind of the commercial world. So you don't really need to be commercially fluent per se. Um, but if you are reading the news and keeping up with it, if you can find any topic in there that's law related and kind of follow it closely, it should give you something else interesting to discuss with your interviewers or in their personal statement, and they'll be really impressed by that further research you've done. I think remember, as I said, there's all sorts of legal like disciplines. You could look at something that is somehow tech law related or something to do with intellectual property law, family law, planning and land law, constitutional law, anything like that. I wrote my personal statement back in October 2019, I think. God, that makes me sound ancient. So Britain was just about to formally leave the EU. I think we left the EU in January 2020. So it was a couple of months before we was planning to formally leave the EU that I wrote my application. And I talked a little bit in mine about kind of the uncertainty of what lay ahead and how EU law no longer had primacy over UK law, how we'd have to kind of replace or adopt our own laws, things like that. I thought it was quite an interesting topic, and I thought navigating that as a law student and into a law career would have been really interesting in the coming years. And it was. We still studied the EU law at Cambridge. I don't know if all unis still do it, but I found it really interesting. And then beyond things to read, you can also do a lot of supercurriculars and other supercurricular-esque things to make your application stand out. So first of all is visit a courthouse and sit in on trials. I think I remember turning up to a courthouse when I was 17. I thought it would be like some big deal and I'd have to book it in advance, like a hairdresser's or something like that. But you just walk in and speak to the I don't know what to call them. I'm going to call it a bouncer. The courthouse equivalent of a bouncer, a bailiff, I don't know. Speak to the bouncers at the court when you get in there, the receptionist, and they'll just say, "Hey, I'm a sixth former, and I would really like to go see a trial." They'll tell you which ones you can go sit in on, and you just get to see how a trial plays out in practice and start to understand the procedure of, I don't know, how law actually unfolds. Another option is work experience. I think a lot of people, when applying to Oxbridge, think this is essential. I never had work experience. I'm from Hull in East Yorkshire, and we don't have like a massive legal market. The firms we have here are very small and local, and they don't really like. Back in my day, they didn't. They weren't very receptive to my out of the blue emails asking if I could have some impromptu kind of work experience. They all just ignored me. Nowadays, I worked as a paralegal in Hull for a year and a half, and we actually had a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds from school coming into our firms. I think the position has improved a lot now, and quite a lot of local firms do advertise for work experience because they realize it's more important. So I'd have a look in your local area, see if there's any work experience you can join, or maybe just shoot an email to your local solicitors and ask if you can just come in for a couple of days, see what they do. Helps you identify any areas of interest, and once again, just see how the law applies in practice. Another thing is year 12 and 13 outreach schemes. A lot of big London firms are doing this nowadays, and it can be a really early pipeline into like the profession and almost secure you a job. So I think Ashurst does something called Ashurst Access, or it might be Clifford Chance Access. Not too sure. I think they both have schemes where you can, in sixth form, go into these firms and experience what life is like as a lawyer. That's a really good like early start into the profession, and shows you something, gives you something to talk about in your application, and shows that you are dedicated to this subject, especially if you are applying at top unis. And also, it kind of gives you an entryway into securing a job after you've got that degree. So it's just kind of setting you up for the future. Another few things of supercurriculars you can do: debating, mooting, or mock trials. I was president of my mooting society at sixth form. We didn't have one until I became president, I guess, not to brag. It was quite fun. It let me kind of build my argument and analytical skills, and we had to work together as a team in the moots, and I was able to kind of talk about all that in my application. And EPQ is another fantastic idea, whether it's on a legal or non-legal subject. I think it shows research, critical thinking, and the ability to kind of conceive a structured argument. And you've got to present it in front of people as well and defend it. Mine was actually on a legal subject. It was on the legal threshold of personhood in English law, which was basically if English law and whether it did what kind of age a fetus would receive any rights under English law. It was a long time ago. It was an interesting subject, and it gave me something else to speak about at interview, especially because one of the professors I got interviewed by was actually did some work in that area, and I read some piece of research by them, so that was a good one. And I knew some people who else did like criminal justice reforms. They did someone did a comparative law review between different jurisdictions. So if you can get like a legal EPQ in there, it really just shows your ability to kind of analyze and research is a good one. Another thing, I never did these, but summer schools. I believe there's some free ones for state educated sixth formers, like the Sutton Trust, I believe. I think they do a summer school, and you can do like different subjects there. And finally, this is another thing that is kind of training contract related rather than specifically applying for uni. But Forage do virtual internships, which once again, if you can't get work experience, you could just do a virtual internship to kind of get a taste of life in kind of practice, what it looks like in different kind of practice areas, and then you can talk about that in your interview. So that's some things you can add into your personal statement to make it stand out and make it seem that you're really dedicated to this career, dedicated to a law degree. But one of the other things I'd recommend when drafting your personal statement is to think about how to make it personal. The clue is in the name. Try and make it anecdotal and singular to you. When I was applying, and probably when Julie was applying to, ChatGPT wasn't a thing yet. So yeah, we couldn't like produce AI slop applications. Basically, we had to kind of write our personal statement from the heart and have actual personal motivations for applying for this degree. I think one thing ChatGPT can do in like AI written way is not tell as much as a compelling or human story or have a clear angle to it. And I think that's what your personal statement should do. So if you're listing any kind of activities or supercurriculars that you've done in your personal statement for law, you should explain the connection to why that means you want to do a law degree or explain what you learned from it. So just saying, oh, I did this, I did youth parliament, I did mock UN. I've heard people say like they've done stuff like that before. Okay, but what did you learn from that and why did that kind of support your decision that you wanted to come study law? To make it personal, for me, I used to work at a local electrician when I was like 15 and 16 doing admin, and I reviewed contracts, and I became quite interested. I wasn't like professionally employed to review contracts. I just did so as part of my job. I looked through them, just I found it interesting, and I became quite interested in kind of legal language. I'd always read through them and try and like identify any loopholes or exceptions. I don't know why. I just did it, and I thought it was fun. And then I started to realize that like contract law was all about the allocation of risk between parties, and every transaction is like underpinned by contract law. And I just don't consciously think about it. Like when I go to the shops, I spend money on my card. There's a contract there. When I pick up an item from the shop, is there a contract there? That's the question you're discussing contract law. The broader idea and theme behind my kind of personal statement was that law touches every aspect of our lives, every transaction, every transgression. So like tort and criminal law does touches every transgression. You cover if someone's done a wrong against you, and every transfer of rights. That could be talking about land, that could be talking about contract, that could be talking about equity. Um, that was kind of the themes that underpinned mine. But try and find something that, like, I don't know, how you realized law was right for you. When did you first discover that, oh, maybe this is something I want to do a bit more? And then factor in all the things you have done to support that story. Make it a very coherent narrative. I would say start at the very beginning saying, oh, I first encountered law here. And then I developed that understanding or passion for law further by doing X. And then moving on to interviews. So quite a very few unis do interviews, I believe, for law. But as I say, I know Oxbridge does do an interview. From my experience at Cambridge's interview process, we had two interviews and the Cambridge Law Test. So the first interview was a piece of unseen material. So we sat there with two interviewers. They give you like a little piece of paper with a scenario on. Mine was something to do with like there's been a car crash, an ambulance comes to pick up the victim, and then it gave me various alternate scenarios like on the way to the hospital, the ambulance crashed because of negligent driving of the ambulance driver, or a drunk driver crashed into the ambulance, killing the victim in the back who's already dying. And it's just kind of testing you on the spot, and asking you, who do you think is responsible for this murder? You're not supposed to have, or the homicide. You're not supposed to know who is you're not supposed to have any legal knowledge to come to a reason, like a solid conclusion at the end of the day. You are just supposed to kind of voice your thoughts out loud with the interviews in front of you so they can hear and see your kind of like your ability to analyze and a situation and think and speak out loud. Um, then the second interview, we was given an hour and a half maybe to analyze some material before discussing it further with the interviewers. I think ours was a piece of legislation. We had to go through it and we had like some type of goal in mind, like seeing if did the legislation say that you could or couldn't do this? And it was really complicated. It might have been a fake piece of legislation, I cannot remember. But then we went into an interview with someone or two more interviews and discussed that a bit more, kind of like a case study interview when you do your training contract. And then finally, we did the Cambridge Law Test, which I don't actually think is no longer around. I think it was, I don't think is any longer around. It was cancelled in 2022. I think the top unis now is Oxbridge and actually quite a lot of the Russell Group unis all use LNAT. So what I'd recommend with the LNAT is it's also, once again, not testing legal knowledge. It's about reading, comprehension, and like reasoning. The format of the exam is it's like you get a passage. It can be on any topic in the world, and then you ask which of one of the following responses is true. So it'll be like a really complicated long passage. It'll be like which one of these inferences is true, and you've got 95 minutes to answer 40 questions. I think the biggest challenge on the LNAT is because it's not to do with legal knowledge, no one comes in with any special knowledge about it. It's just getting used to the format and the timing. Answering 40 questions in 95 minutes with a lot of reading to do can be very, very difficult. So just get used to doing past papers, timing yourself and making sure you're used to that format and timing before you go and sit it. Because ultimately your score in the LNAT can determine whether or not you get an offer from top unis. And then lastly, I'd say if you're kind of wondering what the content of a Cambridge or Oxford or any of their unis interview is like that, just do an interview. I'd say LinkedIn is quite a powerful tool. I did not use LinkedIn when I was, what, year 12 or 13. I didn't use it for most of uni, in fact. But nowadays, I see some year 12s and 13s posting on there. I wouldn't say you got to be super, super active, um, but it might be worth shooting an email, shooting a message to someone on LinkedIn about asking for help or some type of mentorship or just some informal questions you have about maybe if they went to Oxbridge or Durham or wherever else it may be. Sorry to use the Oxbridge example, I just know I had an interview there. You can ask them about what they had in kind of their kind of interview day. And then there's also mentorship schemes. We had Zero Gravity, which I took part in, where you'll basically get a state educated usually, or sometimes it's part of some type of diversity strand. So I know like the schemes like 10,000 Black interns. I'm not sure what they can. There is like an Oxbridge scheme for Black state educated students as well, I believe. And it's free, where you'll get paired with someone from the uni who will then basically mentor you throughout your application. So the mentor can basically help you with interview prep, personal statement prep, admissions testing, anything like that, and any questions you have. So if you are kind of eligible for any of these mentorship schemes that are free, I'd really recommend having a Google of them, having a look online. There'll definitely be a lot of them. I know I helped out with a couple. So just have a look at them, ask any questions to someone who's already there, and they should be able to help you. But other than that, I think that's how you'd stand out in your application. Hopefully, there's a look when you are applying. But Julia, do you have anything to add first of all?
No, yeah, funny thing to add, you mentioned those like summer school work experience things. I used to
Mm,
work at one of them on the law course actually, which is unrelated. You didn't have to work on something that you were doing yourself at university, but
mm,
I essentially helped organize them. And there are lots out there that do scholarships actually these days. There are free ones and then there are ones that you usually have to pay for, but they offer massive discounts or completely free places for people who need them. And they can be really fun, actually. I remember the students really enjoyed it. I helped out on their mock trial day. So they spent 2 days doing like everything to prepare for this mock trial. And then we got like a fancy venue near the Barbican that looked kind of like a courtroom. And then I remember one year we did it at the Supreme Court, which was
oh
insane.
wow.
I've been inside the Supreme Court to help a bunch of sixth formers argue with each other. I can't even remember what it was about now. But yeah, not they can't really work for everyone, I don't think, because they're just quite a commitment over the summer, but they are fun. I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about something which is very, very different. So, um, I don't think I'm going to cover sort of how to get the PGDL. I think the application process is fairly straightforward if you're not doing it as part of like a um, with a law firm. So you need a certain grade and then usually just apply to one of the big law schools. I think the difficult part with the PGDL is juggling the workload. And if you don't have it sponsored by a firm, juggling that intense workload with TC applications. And so I'm starting mine in September, and I've been sort of talking to some people about like who have finished it recently and how they're finding it. And everyone's been saying to me, like, the content itself, it's not massively difficult because it's condensed. There are no optional modules. You just do the 7 core ones, which we've always spoken about. So, what is it? Let me see. Contract, criminal, land, public, tort, trusts. Public, is that
And
EU? Maybe criminal?
yeah, legal system of England and Wales, I think,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that's
I think
kind of
that's the
part of
first
public
one
and
you do, right?
constitutional. Mm.
Yeah. So I think one of the things you can do if you're a little bit nervous about the content is maybe reach out to the law school that you're going to see if they can give you some access to some of the textbooks that you might have. Reach out to people that might have done it beforehand, see if you can get access to their notes. But I don't think there's any point in overburdening yourself with trying to learn the entire course before you start, because it's designed in a way that you just need to do it when you're there. But what I would say is a really good idea, and it's something I'm trying to think about, is just get your life in order before you begin, because you are potentially going to be learning like a couple of topics a week at a rapid pace. And lots of law schools will have exams scattered throughout the year rather than just at the end. So you're consistently going to be being tested, you're consistently going to need to be revising. And if you need to get like a merit or if you need to get a distinction, you're going to need to constantly perform quite well. So make sure you've figured out, I don't know, for me it's exercise. I need to make sure that I remember how to remember to exercise and fit it into my life in a structured way so that when I hit the ground running in September, I don't forget to take care of myself because I think it's just a massive commitment. And I think the same goes for something like your SQE. Um, have an idea about how you're going to revise, maybe, have some like plan for that sort of thing. Talk to someone who's done it previously. I think also, on top of that, if you're not sponsored, you need to make sure that you either accept the fact that you're not going to get many training contracts or vac scheme applications out there in that year, or you're going to need to be very, very organized and, I would say, spend the summer preparing for the upcoming application cycle if your goal is to do the PGDL and security C in the same year. Because once exams hit, I remember it can get very stressful. Someone on my vacation scheme was literally had an exam the day after our vacation scheme ended. And so he was at our partner leaving dinner, really stressed out about his like oral exam. It was one of the ones where you record yourself and you submit that. So, something like that is bound to happen if you're, getting spring vac schemes and you're having to juggle it with some of your exams. Um, but yeah, I think also on top of that, lots of people they sort of think that, oh, the PGDL is often open book. Great. I'm going to be able to just like look into my textbook and find the answers. Obviously, they wouldn't be open book if they thought that you could do that and always get an easy mark, an easy, very good mark. They're open book because there's so much content that you're going to need to make sure that your notes are very organized. So also make sure that you are conscious of that and that you're going to need to make sure that your notes are very easily accessible. I know lots of people use OneNote. There are lots of people who sell notes online. I would avoid these simply because you don't need to pay, I don't know, loads, like 30 quid for someone else's notes. If you think that's worth it, sure. But it's more about making sure that you're taking notes throughout the year, updating them consistently, organizing them, using your breaks wisely. I know that it's important to take a break, but even when I was at university, I always used like our vacations to reorganize all my notes and make sure I knew where everything was so that when the next term came around, I wasn't playing catch up on what I had just done and it was all sort of there. And I think people when they're doing the PGDL just consistently revise stuff as well. So if you've done something a few weeks ago, don't just leave it there because you're going to have to come back to it at some point. Um, and on sort of finally, I think one of the things that no, I've got a few more things actually. If you're getting your TC in that year, if you're sort of applying, you're obviously going to be thinking about your commercial awareness. But even if you have a firm sponsored training contract, firm sponsored place at the law school, you've got your training contract, I would advise against losing your commercial awareness. Keep up with the news. Make sure you know what's going on. And this counts for the SQE as well, because I think people sort of just get bogged down in making sure that they get, the distinction or the merit and then, passing the SQE. But then once you start your TC, you're suddenly going to be expected to know all of these things again to an extent. And also it's just good practice, I think, for when you are, an associate or a senior associate. You just need to make sure that you keep that knowledge going because so much of commercial awareness is sort of gradual, like you slowly build it up over time and things happen and they all influence each other. So if you cut yourself off for a couple of months or a year or two, you're going to suddenly lose a lot of knowledge. And that's something I'm trying to make sure that I do. So I haven't suddenly stopped listening to the FT news briefing just because I've got a TC now. I'm like, no, this is a habit and I'm going to continue it. So that's very important. What else was I going to say? Yeah, one of the things I'm planning on doing, and Ryan, tell me if this is a silly idea or not, is just familiarizing myself as someone who's never done any sort of legal work at all with just what judgments and things like that look like and like legal
Mm.
vocabulary.
Yeah.
Because I just some of the sort of Latin words, I don't know them at all. All I know is anything that's been mentioned in Legally Blonde. And I know that they get you to do for most law school courses like a 25-hour pre-course online thing where you just do it at
Mm.
home, get yourself up to speed with some key concepts. So I think maybe the one thing I'll do is start with that. But I've looked online for some resources and it's all a bit vague. Do you think there are any good
Mm.
ones out there? Can I start with the sixth form ones, do you think, or will that be too
I was
conceptual?
I think you should start with what about law. As I say, the people
Yeah,
who wrote it are all Cambridge academics and they were my supervisors, and they are all very exceptional people. They write fantastically as well. I
yeah,
still think if you've never studied law before, that would be a fantastic introduction to what the subjects you're going to do on the PGDL. Um, and yeah, I mean, they give you a lot of kind of like real life examples in there as well. So it's not just all very abstract. So it fleshes it out a lot more. And it feels a lot more grounded and real. So I recommend What About Law? That's a good one. What else? I'm not too sure, to be honest. I think, as you say, if you can reach out to them and ask if you can get the textbooks early, that's also a fantastic idea. But I think with most law schools, they don't really give you access until a couple of weeks
yeah,
before you start the course. Paying for notes, I wouldn't recommend either. I've never done it. I've looked at someone else's notes though who has done the SQE. And I'm hugely appreciative of like looking at their notes. It's difficult because people have different note taking
yeah.
styles. I like to do mine in Microsoft Word format very, very specifically. Theirs are in Notion, so I'm looking through their notes. And I'm just thinking, this is not how I would do it at all. And the amount of time I would spend on kind of reformatting their notes is almost as quick as it would be for me to make my own notes by just doing my own reading. It's good for like I guess a surface overview, but sometimes like people are also writing shorthand. If you don't know anything about the subject, so you don't know anything about contract law, and you're borrowing someone's contract law notes, and then they just made it like a super revised, a super condensed revision version for them.
Yeah.
They're probably going to cut out most of like the background behind it, so you won't understand anything that's going on. So never, I would not recommend paying for notes at all. I just think it's a bit
I think also,
sketchy.
yeah, exactly. And writing notes and like making that system yourself is part of learning it. I think
Yeah.
what most people have said is that you really just need to focus on making sure that you understand the concepts. And I know that sounds really, really
Mm.
obvious, but if it's open book and you're needing to juggle all of this information and you need to jump through your notes and refer to different things, it's going to be so much quicker if you just have a very fundamental understanding of how things work and you haven't just memorized blocks of text or terms. You need to make sure that that knowledge is quite interconnected with the whole course. And yeah, everyone learns in different ways, but one of those ways can be like writing the notes yourself. So I wouldn't
Yeah.
recommend paying for them unless you think that you can learn how someone else does that quickly. But yeah, I think mostly the best thing to do if you're looking to start the PGDL this September or any of the conversion courses like a LLM or MA is just make sure that you have all your ducks in a row before you start, because once you
Mhm.
start, it's pretty full on. Think about how much they're condensing into those 9 months. Even though a lot is cut out, it's still a lot to wrap your head around. So you need to be pretty clear that that's what you're going to be doing for the next couple of months. I know some people also are quite nervous about the fact about if they're, working alongside the PGDL. I've heard that people can do it, but I've heard that you have to be really, really organized. So it's if you can work during the PGDL, if you have to work, then do. If you can't, I would consider maybe doing it part-time. That was always my plan, that if I couldn't get it funded and if I were pushed to do it on my own, I would fund it part-time. Sorry, I would do it part-time and then I would work alongside of it because it's just a lot. Although tell me anyone in the comments if you're working alongside it full-time, because that is very impressive to me and
Mhm.
you scare me slightly. But yeah,
I I agree. I mean, you made a good point as well about learning how to understand case law and legislation. I don't think it ever gets that much easier. The language they use is so unbelievably complex, and judgments are. It's almost like they make it difficult to read on purpose. They just spiel on and on and on and on for several many pages, and there'll be like one key bit you just need to know. Um, so yeah, maybe just get familiar with like looking at a case, but and looking at legislation too. Legislation is always drafted in a very, very wordy and difficult way, but the more you do it, I guess, the more you get familiar with it and just get used to kind of that sort of circumlocutory structure, which is a big word for using too many words, which is using too many big words, which is ironic because it is a big word, isn't it? But alas,
yeah. When did it
I
get
think that's
easy for
all.
you? When did it get easy
Uh,
for you?
Never.
Oh no. I see my future.
Maybe
This is bright.
maybe when I do the SUE, we'll see.
Oh God, yeah. Well, don't despair anyone. I'm sure you'll smash it. Good luck to everyone who's preparing for the next cycle, who's preparing to do their PGDL, who's preparing to maybe start writing their personal statement. What a throwback. That's it from us. Hope you've enjoyed the episode, and I'll speak to you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.